The history of the United States has been marked with a number of protest movements, which include the African American Civil Rights Movement, the national political efforts to achieve civil rights reform, the anti-war movement, feminism, and the LGBTQ movement. Worthy appreciation is the protest movements differed in the goals, tactics, and the perceived success or failures. This video is intended to compare and contrast three of the protest movements and evaluate the most successful among the three.
Founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal.
In the 1950s and 60s, the African Americans who lived in the southern states suffered increased racial discrimination. They were segregated, subjected to oppression and race-inspired violence, and were barred from the public facilities and common places like classrooms and theaters. Again, the state-sanctioned discrimination based on the separate but equal doctrine contributed largely to the unequal treatment of the blacks by the whites. The civil rights movement was therefore aimed at protesting this mistreatment and championing for equal rights and treatment. The civil rights movement were aimed at harnessing democratic rights for the blacks and the minority groups which have been subject to this unequal treatment. The tactics used nonviolent boycotts, peaceful mass action in the streets, and the activism through arts such as music. The movement was considered a great success as seen in the abolishment of the separate but equal doctrine, the rise into position of power by African Americans, and participation in democratic exercises to include the right to vote. The history of the United States has had instances of American feminist movement, which the primary goal was to break down the barriers for women and lead the women to equal rights the same as the men in the country. In fact, prior to the 1960s, the women in America had their world restricted in all aspects like family and workplace life. Thus, the protests and campaigns used in the movement were aimed to lobby for equal rights or at least the recognition of women in society. The movement aimed at lobbying for better work environment for the women and championing equal rights through imposing the anti-discrimination laws. Finally, the women wanted the right to participate in the democratic process like voting and leadership. The outreach activities and the mass action involved street protests, collaboration with women movements from other regions, and lobbying the Congress to amend certain laws that were perceived as oppressive. The outcome of the feminist movement was considered a success as women were empowered to participate in leadership and democratic processes which they were previously prohibited. Again, amendment of the discrimination laws confirmed the success of the movement by the women.
The time has come for America to hear the truth about this tragic war. I've chosen to preach about the war in Vietnam today because I agree with Dante that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in a period of moral crisis maintain their neutrality. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy especially in time of war.
Through the years, various interest groups in the United States have had to express subjective views on the intentions of America to further own interests through warring with other countries. For example, the anti-Vietnam War campaign movement by the students and the youth were opposed to the views of American government to recruit young people to attack Vietnam. The tactics used in this movement consisted of carrying placards with written messages and anti-Vietnam songs. The formation of the grassroots movement was therefore aimed to pressure the government to stop political wars or end the conflicts. The outcome of the movement can be considered relatively successful as seen in the Vietnam War. Nevertheless, the movement cannot be considered most effective as many people lost their lives due to this war. Therefore, from a comparative analysis, the civil rights movement, especially in the 1960s, was the most successful compared to the other movements, as they facilitated the adoption of equal rights for many minority groups and formed the basis of democratic movement despite the many adversities that was experienced. This movement set the precedents for the feminist, LGBTQ movement, and anti-war movement. The civil rights movement demonstrated that peaceful protests, despite political and racial hatred, prevailed in ending centuries of injustice to minority groups. The history of the United States has been characterized by many protest movements as illustrated by the Civil Rights Movement, the American Feminist Movement, and the Anti-Vietnam War Movement. Even though different tactics were used with the aim of realizing different objectives, the protests were still successful to facilitate system change. The comparison of the success, however, points out that the civil rights movement proved to be the most successful in creating an outline for the following protest movements to come.